That's the part of the brain you need strong and muscular to actually be good at letting go of thoughts. So if you experience your thoughts as highly sticky, it's because the regulator isn't fully developed. You can let your thoughts become less and less sticky just by developing the regulator. And so when a thought comes into your head, you're not stuck with it. You can let go of it and then refocus on something of your choosing. So when people are building that up, gradually they're able to just quiet their mind without the effort of suppressing a thought. But it's like the background attention just knows more what the foreground is trying to do. And so it's just more on board. And so everything in the person is more unified.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at OptimalWork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at OptimalWork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif, here with another episode of the Optimal Work podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be back here with you after a long summer break.
Yeah, Sharif, it's great to be back.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, I was thinking that, I think a lot of people are, finishing up the summer, and maybe students are coming back to school, but also people who work are maybe finishing up family vacations, getting the kids back to school, and ready to dive back into work with renewed enthusiasm. Also, we're recording this on happens to be Labor Day, so it's another good reason to talk about getting back to work. But I thought we could start with some foundational topics of optimal work, fundamental, and how to work better. So you wanted to talk about attention, which I think fits great into that. So Kevin, tell me why you're so interested in attention.
I think that in the summer months, we often experience less of a distinction between work and rest because you're on vacation, you're doing things. So say you're visiting with family and you're talking and hanging out. Well, there's this mixing then of attending to the present moment, but then you're also going to have more free time to be letting your mind wander, to be daydreaming, to be perhaps for some people worrying and ruminating about all the things they're going to have to do when they go back. So there's a sense where there's this mixing of attention being really anchored in the present moment and attention being turned internally. And oftentimes our mastery of our own attention is not really being demanded of us in the summer months so much. So we can experience a little bit of a whiplash coming back in September. And now for us in the Northern Hemisphere, and now we have to be learning to really differentiate what's happening when we sit down to work versus the rest of the time.
Mm-hmm. And so the idea here is that by mastering our attention, we'll be able to work better. So I wonder if you can just talk about what are the fundamental components? I mean, because we talk about, reframing mindfulness and challenge. And so attention is more about mindfulness. So maybe you can just create at a very basic level, especially, for people who maybe are listening to this. This is their first episode of the Optimal Work podcast that they've listened to, just what role attention plays in this sequence.
Yeah. So attention is where work takes place. It's the object of your awareness that you deliberately select. So it's related to your ability to make choices, but it's much more about attending to either what is in the present moment and you do that using what's called the task positive network, TPN, or simply task attention. Task attention has clear signatures in an MRI in functional MRI, when you're looking at how the brain is acting. So when people are anchored in the present moment by mindfulness or by work, they're selectively activating this network in the front of the brain. And then when they're not deliberately doing that, this other area in the back of the brain comes into greater prominence. Now, it's probably never turned off. but it can be more similarly prominent with task attention, or it can be much less prominent. So whenever you're having people do things deliberately, task attention is going to light up. So now what we know more is that think of it as it's part of task attention, but it's almost like another element. It's the regulator. And that's where you're aware of where your attention is. So if you can be aware right now of, am I in the present moment, like while I'm listening or watching this? Or are my thoughts continually going to the past or future? That is specifically activating a kind of attention that we can call the regulator. If people want to look it up, it's the frontoparietal network. Okay, that regulator is what specifically gets stronger and stronger in mindfulness practice. And with greater power of the regulator, you can more completely turn on your task attention and turn down your default background attention. And what you experience is you're just anchored in the present moment and your mind grows quiet. So anything you do to protect the next hour of work for focus is going to make that easier. But mindfulness itself makes it easier. It directly strengthens this regulator. So there's a lot of fascinating things, but what we talk about now is you want the activity of your task attention to be inversely related to the background attention, or vice versa. So that when task attention turns on fully, you want the background attention to turn down fully. And they call that I'll just throw it out there because if you want to look it up, it's the TPN-DMN anti-correlation. It means that these two parts of these two networks are anti-correlated. That is the ideal functioning of the brain. And when we are not exercising our mastery of our attention, like what the summer months can bring, you experience the breakdown of the anti-correlation. And that means that your default mode is about as active as the front task attention all day long. So you kind of go between, it's like half work. You're kind of doing something and you go, ooh, and you think of something else, you get pulled off to it. And then you do something else. And then you're thinking in your head again and daydreaming, you go back to work. That kind of mess in the mind is what happens when you don't have this anti-correlation firmly established. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So you want your task attention when you're focused on the here and now, when that's turned up, you want your background attention, predicting what you're going to do next and stuff, and these more intrusive thoughts turned down. Now, okay, I may have missed this, but do you want ever your default attention turned up and your task attention turned down, or is that always this is like daydreaming, worrying kind of?
I don't think so. And what's kind of funny is that the part of the brain that would have to do that is actually in the task attention. So if you're going to deliberately try to just be, maybe the closest that comes to that is journaling. So, or something where people are deliberately, or free writing. Yeah. So where people are deliberately letting their mind just go and then writing whatever comes into their mind, doing a stream of consciousness journaling. So it could be that would be maybe the opposite of mindfulness. And so, but I'm not like anti-journaling per se, but I think it's very different in the brain because you're, instead of being mindfulness is without words, mindfulness is in the present moment. Mindfulness is usually sensory focused versus self-concept focused, content of word focused, and being about the past or future. So they're very different things in terms of how the brain works. So I'm not sure that we really then ever have a state where the default attention just is completely lit up and the task attention completely turned off deliberately. Because if you're deliberately doing it, you'd be activating the task attention because this FPN network is part of task attention. And so what happens though is, for instance, every morning when we wake up, we experience the loss of anti-correlation between these two networks. So all of us are going to tend to be more like just thoughts coming and going. So you can think of what would you do then to try to deliberately activate your task positive network as soon as you wake up in the morning? So one thing you can do is have like a mantra or aspiration or some go-to phrase that you use as an anchor so that you can be deliberately then trying to like repeat this phrase and try to resonate more with it as a way of holding yourself in the present moment more. And that could do something then to be selectively activating task attention, doing something here in the present moment. I remember like 20 years ago, I had a patient who was this evangelical woman, very nice, and she had trained herself that as soon as she would wake up in the morning, her first thought would be, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." I remember thinking that is way more words than I would ever be capable of doing the very first moment I wake up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do try to jump into bed. But then it's like getting the words to flow that easily. I thought that's a pretty remarkable degree of self-control.
Yeah.
That's one long phrase.
That's
But I think that we experience ordinarily then that as the day gets going, we're better able to keep our task attention stable. We do need occasional breaks though, so that the regulator can reset and the rest of our attention can reset. So it's good that on breaks, we are not making demands of task attention. So it could be that when we're taking breaks in work, we're letting the natural activity of the default mode network to be kind of clearing itself out, and we're working through. And then we can go back to set the stage to work again and engage our task attention fully.
Yeah. So, Kevin, I imagine that if people aren't really taking care of this relationship, that can cause a lot of difficulties for their way of working. One would just be difficulty focusing. Like if you're not really, I hate to use the word because I know you don't like it, disciplined. If you're not disciplined about the activity of your task attention versus default attention, you're just kind of letting new thoughts arise and you don't really make any effort to control them. That then when you actually sit down to do your work, in particular a difficult task, it's just going to be harder to keep yourself focused on the work. Maybe you'll be more likely to procrastinate, to distract yourself, to go off task. So is this an area where you see that being most relevant? Is this the kind of the problem that we're trying to solve here?
So I think that for our work to really be capable of achieving its greatest creativity and flexibility, we need mastery of our regulator, of our attention, so that we are able to, at will, selectively activate our task attention, be immersed in the present moment, while still utilizing the good that comes from the default mode network. And so there's this interesting phenomenon, another interesting like scientific phenomenon, which is that part of our frontal parietal network, the regulator, with practice being activated deliberately, which is like what mindfulness does and what focused work does, with practice, it actually can, elements of it, switch allegiance to the default mode network. And the effect is that now your default mode network's intelligence goes up. So it's as if your frontal systems are able to communicate now. They have an inside track into what the default mode is doing. And you experience that as more effortless attention. So the more you can deploy parts of this regulator so that sometimes they're totally in task attention, but when needed, they can then switch and become part of the default mode network. But now the default mode network has this stronger frontal component. So it's more under deliberate voluntary control. This is what's behind when people practice mindfulness. After a time, they have fewer and fewer thoughts come to mind. I often teach people mindfulness with the hand exercise and use, now if your thoughts are in the present moment, you have your hands straight up. But the moment a thought comes in that's about the future, you push the palm forward. Or if it's about the past, you put the palm backwards. And then you have people just label thoughts as they enter their mind. This awareness of where your thoughts are right now, are they present or are they past future, is selectively activating your regulator. This area of the frontal cortex where you're aware of where your attention is. And then every time your default mode gives you some thought, it's going to be from the past or future, you are aware of that, you let it go, and you re-anchor on the present moment. Those are the 3 movements of mindfulness, which really means you let go of whatever comes from your default attention, any thought that enters your head at all, you let it go, and then re-anchor on the task at hand. And so that's selectively working this regulator. That's where you let go. That's the part of the brain you need strong and muscular to actually be good at letting go of thoughts. So if you experience your thoughts as highly sticky, it's because the regulator isn't fully developed. You can let your thoughts become less and less sticky just by developing the regulator. And so when a thought comes into your head, you're not stuck with it. You can let go of it and then refocus on something of your choosing. So when people are building that up, they're gradually, they're able to quiet their mind without the effort of suppressing a thought. But it's like the background attention just knows more what the foreground is trying to do. And so it's just more on board. And so everything in the person is more unified. So when people are in that state with a highly developed regulator, they have much greater creativity because the background is what you need active to be creative, coming up with possibilities for the next step. But you want that background activity really coordinated with your intention, which is a foreground activity. What am I working here? What am I trying to do here? So you think of like you're trying to brainstorm, for instance, a solution to a problem, you want to come up with all these creative possible solutions. Well, in order to do that kind of very high level work, you need this integration of the front and back of the brain. That is what mindfulness, if you do 15 minutes a day, actually allows you to do. You need some practice every day of deliberately attending to one thing, and then everything that goes against it, you let go of and refocus on that thing.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. So, okay, just to clarify, so that you mentioned 3 steps, and those are recognize or detect, release, and then re-anchor. Okay.
Yep.
So
exactly.
And so we want to
the 3 R's.
The 3 R's. So recognize, then we're not using detect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Recognize, release, re-anchor. Yep.
And so you suggest that, well, these are, when you're doing a time of work, when you're on a task, you want to have your attention well developed so that you can actually focus on the task and accomplish it effectively. But in some cases, our regulator may not be fully developed to regulate our attention properly. So we want to take time to deliberately practice these steps to actually get good at them before we then try to deploy them then in the context of work.
Yeah, so you can think about warming up your regulator. Okay, so that's the value of doing a little bit of mindfulness before you start working. So in the golden hour on Optimal Work, we have a 3-minute, I think now I just made a 1 minute and a 5 minute. So we're going to have variable lengths of mindfulness that people can do. So where you try to do a certain amount of time where you can deliberately practice holding your attention on the awareness of the breath. And then whenever thoughts come in that are not the breath, you just let go of and then re-anchor on the breath. So you detect the incoming thought, you recognize it, you release it, and then you re-anchor on the breath. That warms up the regulator, your frontoparietal network. And when that's warmed up, it's going to be much more able to anchor you than in the task when you start it and keep your task attention online. Keep your default mode network quieter. You can tell when you sit down to work how jumpy your mind is. Just close your eyes and wait and see how long does it take for thoughts after thoughts to come and enter, and thoughts about different topics. It's just a wonderful practice to learn to quiet the mind. That quieting the mind is your regulator turning on So on the one hand, you can just be detecting, releasing, re-anchoring. But gradually, with practice, as it gets really muscular, it's able to, part of it will deploy, become part of your background attention, and just keep it quiet. So that's a fruit of more prolonged practice, but it does happen. And it's kind of everyone's experience, I think. If you have enough mindfulness practice in a given day, it does become much easier to quiet the mind.
Okay, Kevin. So now we're talking about like a particular path, which is that we're trying to strengthen our attention by undertaking this kind of like an exercise program for your mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, it's not easy because to sit down for some time and just perform these exercises. And maybe a lot of people some people who are listening to this right now would think, well, this is a lot of work, and my preferred approach to attaining focus in my work is actually just to kind of put it off until I get until it's like the night before, and then I get a huge adrenaline rush, and then I just kind of power through it. So what would you say to someone for like the larger context of, being happy, living a flourishing life, to pursue this path of practice and exercise and like the more disciplined approach to building up this muscle of attention, as opposed to relying on this kind of procrastination, deadline, adrenaline approach?
I'm all for adrenaline. And so if people strategically procrastinate so that they don't have much time to waste when they actually sit down to do a task, like let's say they know that it's going to involve a certain amount of research. They don't want to let themselves do too much research. So people can strategically procrastinate, right? But even then you can tell it's part of a plan. There is some overarching plan behind it. The plan is how your frontal cortex puts order in the background attention. And so having a plan is a pattern for your awareness to follow over time. The plan, actually, when you sit down to work, will reduce the amount of effort it takes your brain to predict what comes next. So the main problem with unplanned work is that it is much more taxing on the brain. This is why they need more adrenaline than to actually do it. So in many cases, because it's so demanding on the brain. I think that if it's true that, as I think it probably is, at least 70% of the brain's activity is all about predicting what comes next, then you can, actually I heard it said it's 80%. You can save then up to 80% of your brain's effort just by laying out steps in advance. And that even means over the course of days. So if you, so anything you can do to lay out a plan for an hour of work, a plan for a day, or a plan for a week, you're making it easier for your default attention in the background to predict what needs to be ready when. What you'll find is that all of these activities, the hour, the day, the week, take much less effort. Everything feels more natural when you get to it. Every memory seems a little more crisp. Your skills seem more available to you. So, and all with much less effort. So like if you want the easiest experience writing a paper, start 5 days in advance. For a typical 5 to 10 page paper. Start 5 days in advance. Start to do the painful work early of pulling what's the main ideas you want to be, what are the resources, what's the potential outline, and then set it aside. Then the next day you can come back and you'll find a lot of the work has been done. That's because your brain is more efficiently able to use your default attention in the background, outside your awareness, to be putting order in things. So now when task attention picks up the task again and focuses on it, a lot of stuff has already been done. So there's a real, we have to learn to make our work easier by leveraging more the power of the default attention. So, and you do that by making a clearer plan for yourself in work. But that also makes it easier for you to have awareness of where is my attention right now. Planning strengthens the regulator. Making a plan, even for the next hour, activates your regulator, the frontal parietal network, and particular part of it, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, gets activated by planning, but also by this kind of meta-awareness of what am I attending to right now. I think a lot of optimal work comes down to learning how to do that kind of perspective shift. Before you just dive into something, go into the tunnel of the work, you look over the task as a whole, try to form a plan of where you want to go. And then now you've kind of given your default attention the pattern to follow. And now you can put your task attention into that tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, Kevin. So I have one last question for you, which, because we're kind of closing in here. So one thing that occurs to me, we're talking about exercises to improve your attention, ways of improving that. And it seems like when you're actually doing physical exercise, your attention is just held in the present moment just by performing whatever, exercise you're trying to do, whether it's, well, maybe less so with like a kind of long aerobic, like a long run. Some people's minds tend to wander when they're running.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if there's any sense of physical activity being helpful for training your attention, or any thoughts you might have on that.
I think physical activity does help people to be more anchored in the present moment, particularly work. When people work, with their hands, craftsmen, for instance, that kind of work, it's easier for the default attention to turn off and people to hold their attention because the hands have an ability to rivet the attention. And I've heard it said that this was 30 years ago, I think I learned this, that the incidence of attention deficit disorder in people who do manual labor is something like less than 0.2%. It's something is incredibly, minor. I have no idea. I haven't been able to verify that statistic, but so I don't know if someone was exaggerating or not. But it seems to be true that the more our work does not involve our hands, the harder it can be for people to stay attending to the task. Now, that would get easier the more they practice their activating their regulator. I also think that there is another part of there's another network, the sensory motor network, that might be more involved with physical activity and also with music, that it gets into this in-between zone where there's a lot of the brain that's being used. So it's not just these attentional networks. That's why I think if people do any kind of physical work, they can turn it into mindfulness practice if they try to just deliberately hold their attention in the present moment. And anytime their thoughts come to mind, their mind starts wandering, then they can learn to let go of it and refocus on the task at hand. There are some things also that specifically use our regulator. And one of those is slowing down the breath. So to be aware of the breath uses part of our prefrontal cortex, but to be deliberately slowing down the breath activates more the regulator so that we're able to be more in control of an otherwise automatic process. And so if people learn to slow down the breath, particularly the exhale, there are all these benefits then. This will actually be a whole nother topic, but we can talk about the benefits of slow breathing. But it can be especially powerful at holding our attention fully in the present moment.
Awesome, Kevin. Okay, well, I think that's it for today. It's good to be back.
Sharif. Yeah, this is nice. It's
good to be back.
Hope everyone listening had a great summer and is now ready to reactivate their regulators.
That's right. Okay. Well, Kevin, thanks so much, and we'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out OptimalWork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.